Hello, everyone. As we have people joining us, just wanted to welcome you all to the Insights on Agricultural Land Access and Stewardship series. This is the second presentation in this newly established series that's hosted by the Agricultural Land Equity Initiative at the California Strategic Growth Council. So I'm going to say a tiny bit about our initiative and some of the other work we have going on, and then I'm excited to introduce today's speaker. So Ken, if you could please advance to the next slide. Just wanted to note for people who might not already be familiar with the work of the California Agricultural Land Equity Task Force, this is a group that is administered by the Strategic Growth Council, and this Insights series is meant to host public presentations and conversations related to the work that the task force is engaged in. That task force is currently working on recommendations to the governor and legislature about how to equitably increase access to land in California for food production and traditional tribal agricultural uses. So today we're very excited to explore an important element of the task force's conversations and that process with Michelle Lee, the founder of the Circle Law Group, who will be talking about her experience and expertise with advancing tribal sovereignty, ancestral land return, and some of the barriers that she has encountered in her work, and possible ways forward from there. So I'm very excited to welcome Michelle Lee. Thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you for having me. And I'm going to see if I can share my screen now. Um, Here we go. Hopefully, there we go. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name's Michelle Lee. I'm a member of the Pit River Tribe from Northeastern California, and I'm also a Maidu descendant from the Greenville, Lake Elsinore area. And on the southern side of California, I'm Cahuilla from the Cabazon Band of Mission Indians. And the reason I have so many tribal affiliations is because my grandparents met at Indian boarding school. So I definitely carry the legacies, as unfortunate as they are, of the boarding school system here in California, as well as being a descendant of a survivor of a massacre in Northeastern California. And I'm here today. We're still here. And there are many of us who carry all of that with us as we do our work. So that does definitely inform my work. I'm deeply rooted here in California, obviously, and have thousands of cousins because we've imagined being always from here. And that is very unique. I always think about people from other countries that have always been here, been there, and how the United States is so unique that everything is relatively recent. But what we're talking about predates what we're the constructs that we're talking about today. So I'm going to get started just with some basics because I know there's probably a mixture of different backgrounds that are attending today. Um, what's the word? Is it Indian, Indigenous, Native American, American Indian? People sometimes get worried that they're not being politically correct. Um, I say I still get tongue-tied. I think in my introduction, I said I'm a member of the Pit River Tribe, and that's my easiest go-to. But it's complicated because I have all these other affiliations. But usually in the past, I used to say American Indian when I was younger. Today, I say Indigenous. I don't really prefer Native American because people without Indigenous roots can say, well, I'm Native American too, because I was born here, kind of thing. So, but Indian to me is not a bad word. And actually, as an attorney, uh, the phrase is Indian. And there's 25 USC, the United States Code is Indians. Indian law is a legal construct that won't change to become Native American at any time. It's Indian reservations, Indian tribes, Indian as an individual Indian. But technically, an Indian is an individual that's a descendant of people that lived here in what's now the United States before colonization. And generally speaking, it's somebody that is recognized as Indian in their individual community. And so you can have people that have indigenous descendancy, but not necessarily community. And those folks are, there's a lot of people that aren't connected to their tribes, but they're still Indian. So it is a complicated definition. But the tribes themselves, they are sovereign and independent governments that exist today. Many are not sovereign, they're not recognized, but the federally recognized tribes are tribes that are listed on the Federal Register. Their names are on a list, and they're all identified as having a unique government to government political relationship with the United States. And there were many thousands of tribes across the country, and there were definitely several hundred in California. So today in California, there are, and sometimes people say 109. I say 110 because I include Quezon, which is kind of counted in both Arizona and California. And there are at least 80 unrecognized tribal groups that are currently seeking federal recognition. And so there were tribes everywhere in California. So whether it's highly populated cities or unpopulated, less populated rural areas, there were tribal people in every area of the state of California. And even in like the Donner Lake High Sierra, where it's very rugged territory, Washoe people live there. And I often think about that because I spend time up there. And even in the book Ordeal by Hunger, where they talked about the Donner Party, Native people were there and knew about it and have their own oral history for observing what happened to the Donner Party. So people may not think about these remote areas having native people in it, but they definitely did. So deserts, mountains, rivers, ocean. All of that was going on. A very highly populated state, very rich natural resources as today. And it was even more plentiful back then before the land grab. So we have, colonization happening in the Spanish arrived in the late 1700s. The mission system started along the coast, and I'll mention that a little bit later, that what happened there. But gold was discovered in the foothills, and that unfortunately led to legalized bounty hunting of California Indians to clear the land for non-Indian settlement. And it's just a fact of history. It happened. There was a state law on the books that did compensate people for killing Indians. And unfortunately, there's a lot of instances of large-scale massacres, particularly in Northern California. And Southern California was hit mainly with the mission system, which I'll mention a little bit more. But the goal was to clear the land for non-Indian settlement. Were reservations established in the 1850s, and the goal was to finally rid, us of this class of population. And there were forced marches into the reservations. There was one in Mendocino, and there was one up the Mendocino, and then there's Nome Cult Reservation, and there were forced marches, and those marches are still honored today by walks. There's traditional or annual walks that commemorate. It's kind of like our version of a Trail of Tears. The 1850s and 60s, the lands became open to homesteading, and because of the forced removal, the land was available. And so homes flooded in, and they were able to claim 160 acres for every male head of household as long as they physically possessed the land. And unfortunately, Native people were not able to claim land, and because we weren't citizens until 1924. So even though we were on the land, we didn't qualify to claim it as a homestead. So that's how a lot of Native land was lost. Uh, and that's why we have land return today. There's this the taking that occurred. Um, and there's lots to unpack with that. And I just recently attended a land grab university symposium at UC Davis, and There were, land grant colleges, and there were corporate interests that took land, the precursors of PG&E and large industries that got lots of land, the railroads. And so corporations benefited also greatly from the land grab and continue to benefit from those lands today. But there are these unrecognized, not still non-recognized tribal groups across the state, and these are just names of a few of them: Confederated Villages of Lejeune, the Amamutsun, the Tongva. They all generally are on the coast for the most part. So the reason they're on the coast is because that's where the mission system occurred, and they were subject to a different experience that led to a lot of acculturation and loss of their indigenous way of life through the mission system. And because the coastal areas were more populous, a lot of the time they were just assimilated into society, and weren't considered when Indian agents went around looking to see where surviving Native people were, and they were left out of the reservation system. And so that's one of the kind of a simple explanation as to why we don't have many areas in the state of California along the coast that have federally recognized tribes there. There's only some up north on the north coast, and then you have Kashaya in Sonoma County, and then there's a big jump down to Santa Barbara, and that's it as far as coastal tribal connections or reservations. There's no more. So I just wanted to have a couple slides about tribal cultural resources, because this really is our entrance to what we now call land back or land return. Again, the map shows California tribal peoples, and we have these different kind of cultural areas: the Northwest, the Northeast, the Central, and the Southern. But we have over 160 Aboriginal tribes in the state. With Imagine that, living there in all of these places. We had villages and burial grounds and trails. I wish I would have had a slide about all of our trails, because there was a very detailed trail system across the state of California that was used for trade and commerce among the native people. They knew each other. They spoke different languages. There were interpreters. There was a very complex society thriving in California that had access to tremendous amount of resources, whether they were natural resources from foods and plants, and then there were tremendous amount of wildlife. Back at early contact, the records and the letters of the early explorers express the awe of the amount of birds that would be in the wetlands, because California is a giant wetland. Aboriginally, the whole central part of California was a wetland. And we've obviously changed and reconfigured the geography of California, but there was once a large lake in the Central Valley, and it returned last year for a period of time and flooded a portion of Central California. But the Central Valley irrigation project reshaped and restructured the land by moving water. And traditionally, you would kind of think of it as like a toilet bowl. You have all the water from up north, and it flushed down to the south and to the Central Valley. And that's why the lands were so rich and fertile for agriculture, because they were wetlands and floodlands, and so they had that deep, rich nutrients from fish and animals that live there. And those areas defined the tribe's cultures. They varied from place to place. So Northwest, you're going to have different resources than you're going to have down in the desert, and so our cultures are different. But the one thing that does stay the same is we had a material culture that leaves evidence, including from our homes, our kitchens, and particularly our our burial grounds are found across the state because we lived here for, you know, we know archaeology can want to limit it to around 10,000 years, but our archaeology, the record goes back well past. I think the oldest California approved by archaeology date is around 14,000 years ago. So with the California cultural preservation, and this does lead into our land return topic, because it wasn't until 1948 that we had a right to vote. 1968 we became we have the Indian Civil Rights Act and got civil rights. 1978 we got religious freedom. And then 1990, there was the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act, because so many of our burials had been removed. So much of our archaeology, our remains and history was put into curation, and we wanted it out and put it back. And so that started a process of activism. And then in California, specifically in 2004, is when we first had the law to require consultation with tribes when there's going to be developments that are going to hurt our cultural resources. And then those have expanded since that time. And then today we have, we're in an era of truth and healing, which is to kind of rectify or acknowledge what happened and see what the state can do to rectify the state's part in the genocide that occurred here. So since it wasn't until 2004 that there was any kind of consultation or involvement of tribes in the state government for in any meaningful way, or local governments, we have all of this loss of our cultural resources, and there's a lot of concern by tribes about what's left. And that gets us into land back and land return. So there's a group, a nonprofit called Indian Collective, and they define land back as a movement that has existed for generations with a long legacy of organizing and sacrifice to get indigenous lands back into indigenous hands. Currently, there are land back battles all across the country, and a lot of Native people call America Turtle Island. I'm going to just try to zip through one example, and I might kind of run through a couple of slides from a second, but I know I'm already kind of short on time. But I'm going to focus on Potter Valley. And now the Potter Valley tribe is a tribe from Mendocino County. And this is a map of their traditional territory, Pomo people generally. So Pomo, there's lots of different types of Pomo, and they all very much stick to their area. So if you're northern Pomo, like Potter Valley, your territory is in this general vicinity, and you're going to be different, and you're going to speak a different language or a different dialect than central, southern, southwestern, eastern. They're all different language speakers. We have so many languages in California. We have California and Australia are the two places in the world that have the highest concentration of language diversity in the world. And so that creates identity and identities that are very distinct. So the Potter Valley tribe is traditionally located in what's now the Potter Valley in Northern California, but it doesn't, they might trade and interface with the surrounding counties. They originally after the gold rush, and there were some awful massacres that occurred in their area that some of them survived. They ended up, some individuals bought land themselves. They purchased land, and then the federal government purchased some land. And so they created a rancheria with the federal government. The federal government acquired some land. And then Congress, unfortunately, in 1958, passed laws that terminated tribes in California. They terminated their federal recognition status, and Potter Valley was one of those. So they lost their status, they lost their lands. They went into fee status, and they were lost to the tribe. And then they were later restored to federal recognition. So there's 44 tribes out of the 109 that were terminated, and then most of them were later restored. And so this is a common topic in Indian law in California. And so kind of fast forward, the tribe didn't have land and they didn't have a reservation. They had some land that they had purchased in fee, but uh, in 2003, the CPUC, they approved a bankruptcy settlement for PG&E. And so PG&E has gone through several bankruptcies. This is one of the first. And when that happened, PG&E was going to sell off a lot of their real prime real estate in their watershed areas that they weren't using anymore. And there were many participants, intervening parties that objected to that because the lands were so important to so many people. And so through this litigation, there was a negotiated settlement, and um, and it resulted in tribes stepping up to want land return. Um, so the hydro facilities themselves were not generally available, but the watershed lands, PG&E was trying to sell them to the highest bidder. And as I said, there was litigation, and then there was a settlement agreement, and there was a stipulation. And in the stipulation, there was a new entity called the Stewardship Council, and the Stewardship Pacific Forest and Watershed Land Stewardship Council. And that was comprised of a lot of these interested parties. So there was not NGOs, nonprofits, a tribal representative, which was essentially a state representative, but and different interests. And they convened this process where there would be an interview or a process to see who could get the land. And they wanted to make sure that tribes could participate, but there was a lot of opposition to tribes receiving land return through this process because there was at that point, and that's why I really wanted to focus on this one particular land acquisition, because this is one of the first ones in California. There was a lot of opposition to tribes getting land, even though it was land returned because it was land that had been taken from them originally. There was very little understanding of that. And there was also this big fear that, well, what's the tribe going to do with it? There's all this talk. What are they going to do with it? Are they going to try to build a casino on it, or what are they doing? And so it was really unfortunate because there were other parties like Cal Trout and the UCs, and they weren't really facing a lot of these same kinds of questions. But we worked our way, and I did represent Potter Valley on this acquisition, and we worked our way through a lot of it, but it still had a lot of burdens placed on this acquisition. Initially, the tribe was approved for 723 acres of what they call the Eel River Planning Unit located in Mendocino County. And it did require that there be a conservation easement on the land, and the tribe had to waive sovereign immunity so that the transaction could be enforced because they thought the tribe's going to try to get out of all of this. And then the tribe wanted more of the land, and they were only getting a part of it. And so the tribe kept coming back and saying, we really want the rest of this. And they did get 219 more acres, but not all of it. But they still are trying to get the rest. And so after 12 years, the tribe finally closed on the property, and they got 879 acres back. But they still want to participate in these orphaned hydro projects that are on the adjacent to the property, and it's very complicated. But the donated lands were the gray, and the retained lands were the yellow. And this was a tough process because, but if you think about it, nobody was using this land. It is the most neglected land, and that's the case in a lot of these land return transactions. Is the land is land that is hard to care for because it's remote. It takes a lot of resources. This property in particular is very, it could, PG&E is I'm not uncomfortable saying it here. PG&E is a terrible land manager. And I understand the Southern utilities also are as well. And when we're talking to PG&E about this property and we wanted to know, like, do you have a land management department? And could we talk to them? And they said, oh, no, we don't. We don't manage land. And so the land has just been there. And they actually didn't know even the boundaries of their property. And so there were boundary disputes that we had to work out, and that's partly why it took so long. But this is an area that could just go up like that in a fire because PG&E has not taken care of it. And so what the tribe wants to do, and they are doing, is take care of it and bring fire, safe fire back into the region, clear it out, to do fuels reduction, manage the land for habitat and species and watershed, and do responsible land management on the property, which does take a lot of time and a lot of money. And unfortunately, for PG&E, they retained most of the land that they were supposed to donate. So they kept 70% of it. And a lot of people were really upset about it. But for some reason, returning land to the tribes just seems to be a really hard thing. It's getting easier. My tribe, Pit River Tribe, we did receive, was another tribe that received some donations. It was very hard fought to get those back, but they have been returned. And I like to say that as a result of these transactions going through, that one of the results was this CPUC tribal land return policy. And that is a policy where if there's land that's going to be disposed of by an investor-owned utility, an IOU, that they have to notify the tribes that are aboriginal to the land and provide them with an opportunity to acquire it. And that it might sound like, to an uninformed person that didn't understand the backdrop, that seems like an unfair preference, but really it's the tribe getting the land back that was taken from them in what today would be viewed as unlawfully. And so it gives them an opportunity to take stewardship over the land and actually take care of it. And just, there was a similar process with Moortown, only it's more recent. And it is very different because it's not through a CPUC or a state body, but they're on the Feather River, and their lands were also, and I don't want to dwell on the awful history, but they went through serious massacres and land grab and the things that many of the tribes went through, the forced removal and the marches. They also had private individual allotments, Indian lands that were taken away from them by Great Western Power, who's the predecessor to PG&E. And so it's basically like there's no receipts for this land. They got the land, but they can't show how they got it. And so Moortown also was a tribe that had land, and then they were terminated, and then they went through incredible hardship. They were terminated, and then they lost their land, and then again, I'm just kind of speed dialing on this. They were restored through litigation. And now today, they don't have those lands that they originally had that were set aside for them as a rancheria, but they are wanting the land back from PG&E. And the tribe has been buying land in their Aboriginal territory. And the beautiful thing about Moortown's acquisitions, I mean, it's sad that they have to buy their land back. Obviously that doesn't seem very fair for them, but they take care of the land and they are managing it. They interface with BLM and the U.S. Forest Service. Moortown Rancheria does fuels reduction for the forests for the United States and for the BLM. and they are managing their lands along with the federal government's lands and taking ownership and responsibility. I mean, for their lands and responsibility and stewardship for the federal government's lands. And what they're doing is providing a benefit to the environment, to the watershed, and hopefully they will create an environment that is less subject to catastrophic fire, which unfortunately did ravage that area in recent years. So they are taking stewardship responsibility. So some of the challenges are, this, like I said earlier, the lands that tribes get back today often are the worst managed lands. They're lands that were taken and used for collateral, and that's what PG&E did. PG&E and the land grant colleges from all over the country. There were interests all around the country that utilized their land holdings in California as collateral for other things. And so I like to say that the land's been working for a long time. And what we would like to do is retire it, and take care of it because it's worked for a long time. And while it wasn't taken care of in a real meaningful way on the ground, the land itself, it was working as collateral and as an asset for a long time. And so even infrastructure, there's generally on a lot of these properties, there's not access to water and utilities. Um, Another issue is property taxes, that when there's an acquisition and the acquisition is for a greater, higher value, you could have land that has been in the same ownership for a really long time because they were early land grab acquisitions. And so the property taxes for the prior owner is low, but then the tribe has to pay this higher value for the land, and so the property taxes go up, which doesn't make a lot of sense for the tribe to be paying higher property taxes for land that they're trying to get back. And actually I have a bill for that to fix that in front of the legislature right now. And then, capacity funding, there can be zoning issues. There's lots of real property issues with these lands that once you start to unwind the the issues for a particular parcel, you can find all kinds of concerns because they've just been ignored for so long. And then unfortunately, with many interests that are maybe going to transfer to the land to a tribe, they're worried that the tribe's going to use it in some nefarious way, and they want to tie it up with deed restrictions or conservation easements, which is not really a fair thing, but some tribes will do it because they don't intend to build anything on it. But what it does is it inhibits the tribe's sovereignty and ability to use the land in the way that they are hoping to. And the cost today for lands to buy them back, it's always higher for a tribe versus another buyer. Unfortunately, sadly today, tribal people will be asked to pay a much higher price to buy land than anybody else. The opportunities for lands return are everywhere. We see municipalities and cities. The churches are being interested now in donating land to tribal entities. Academic institutions are looking at their land holdings for maybe even just a place to rebury ancestors that have been disturbed and maybe been repatriated out of curation. And then, of course, all your usual state and national parks, there's opportunities for land return. And private landowners are increasingly reaching out to tribes to see if they can will or deed or title their lands over to Indian tribes and receive a tax deduction, which is you can. Tribes are charitable organizations under the Internal Revenue Code, and it is a tax deductible transaction. So I have a few resources here. I didn't talk about the non-recognized tribes and how they factor into this too much, but Segurite Land Trust, they have some wonderful resources that they have a collaboration with the Sustainable Economies Law Center, and they've created a lot of tools and resources for people that are and entities that are interested in land return and land issues. So I'm gonna leave it there, and hopefully there's some questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was really valuable. Appreciate those examples and comments and thoughts about ways forward. We do have one question right now in the chat. I'll encourage everyone who's on the call to put your questions in the chat, or if you have a question that you'd like to ask, please do raise your hand and we can help to unmute you. The question we have right now for you, Michelle, is what is the bill called that
Yeah.
you mentioned so we can learn more and support?
Yes, let me look it up really quick. Yeah, the thing about legislation and land return and all of these issues, we do interface a lot with the legislature because the laws don't really accommodate these types of transactions. And so much of Indian law is trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. So the bill number is it's AB 1485 1485, and it's real property tax documentary transfer tax exemptions for Native American tribes. And the assembly member is Macedo from down in the Hanford area, I believe. And she's somebody that is excited about this topic because it doesn't seem fair for tribes to pay more in property tax than anybody else ever did before, especially if they are going to commit to keeping it in conservation. And sometimes tribes are even doing creating uses that are more public in nature. So or at least maintaining public access. So for example, with Potter Valley and Pitt River, with the PG&E land donations, they were obligated to ensure public access. And public access doesn't mean everybody gets to come in there. It's just that there's some kind of regulated public access because of course, state parks, local parks, no one lets people just run in and go wherever they want. So there's some limited public access that's available, and tribes can create campgrounds and some related businesses that are to support recreation. Many of the watershed lands obviously are used for recreation and canoeing and kayaking and fishing and swimming, and so those uses would be maintained. There's no closing of rights, and I think that's one of the issues that we see happen more when you have private ownership, where you have, quite frankly, wealthy folks purchasing land and it's private property, and that's when you start seeing gates, like we have the situation up in Lake Tahoe, where you have so many areas that I know when I was young and growing up, and I used to spend a lot of time there because I lived up in that area when I was young, and there's so many places you can't go anymore. You just can't access them because they're cordoned off and they're private. And so I think tribes in their acquisitions, they are at this point up to now doing it for the purpose of some type of conservation use, or they, and now I think tribes are to the point where they're feeling that they want housing and things too. And so those are going to continue to be pure acquisitions that they purchase and use for housing. And we have a lot of obviously low income housing needs, whether you are a Native person or not. But for tribal people, they have some ability to create tribal low-income housing programs on lands that are either fee or they can take it into trust. And I didn't really talk about taking the land into trust, But one of the issues, concerns that folks have with land return is, well, what if the tribe puts it into trust and then we can't control what they're going to do with it? And, the tribes get frustrated with that mentality because they are the original stewards of the land and don't have an intention of destroying it. So the idea that the tribes are not responsible stewards at some point, hopefully it becomes smashed because they are responsible stewards. Uh, um, but they also have the need and desire to create economic opportunity for their citizens and to create communities and housing that's safe. So, I think at some point a fear of Native people um, will hopefully, be addressed through public education to the extent we can still do that in this era. Um, but interfacing and sharing information. And that's why I agreed to do this today, because it is important for folks to hear from a Native perspective why we want to acquire this land, um, and also understand the history, because not everybody gets exposed to the history of California. And while this is just a little piece of that history, and I've just spoken in a very general way, I can say that the history has been rough, and it's getting better today. And Governor Newsom did issue a formal apology on behalf of the state, which may have seemed like that's not that big of a deal. But I was actually there the day that he sat with tribal people and apologized. And I got to say, there was a lot of tears, and they weren't all sad. Um, it's very meaningful to have the governor of the state of California apologize for the state's part in the massacres that occurred here. And because it was the law at that time. And the first governor was very vocal in his intention to kill Indian people and to clear the land. Our first Supreme Court judge, Serenus Hastings, um, was someone that urged the clearing of the land in Mendocino County, and that's why there was a push to change the name of Hastings Law School, and now it's University of San Francisco Law School, because of that history of the anti-Indian history that he embodied. And so addressing that history, we don't have to live in that. We don't have to feel guilty about it, but we can understand it and understand why Native people are motivated by that history and want to do positive things for their people. And more than that, the tribal people that I know I interface with on a regular basis, including earlier today, I was at a convening of a tribal energy summit, and the tribal leaders there want to have sustainable energy, and grid resiliency and safe grids, not just for themselves, but for their local community. Because generally speaking, the tribes in many parts of the state are a provider of emergency services when there's a catastrophe. So we're here, tribal people are here to be participating with their communities and want to be a good partner. So land return is really an investment into a local community, to allow for the tribe to really build the infrastructure that it needs. And they will be providing services to non-tribal people as well. So there were some comments in the chat. that I may have missed.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Would you like me to read? Looks like there's one question here. Would you like me to read that aloud?
Sure.
So many funding sources for land acquisitions require deed restrictions relating to public access, open space protection, conservation, etc. How do you balance that reality with the need to respect Indian sovereignty?
Yeah, that's really the sort of the guiding principle right now. And I'm hoping we can pivot to get away from that because originally with Potter Valley, they were really heavy on all of the restrictions. Today, the state, like California Natural Resources Agency and Cal Fire, and California Department of Fish and Wildlife, there's grant funds for land acquisition for tribes. And they do have these deed restrictions and conservation principles, but the funding source is because it's 30 by 30 type topic. So we're trying to create a nature-based solution for some of the environmental problems that we faced, including and really specifically wildfire. And so the fact that we had that big fire in Los Angeles, I think there was some element in the conversation down there about if tribal nature-based solutions were implemented with through co-stewardship with these different state and federal entities that own the land, then there could have not been as maybe the fire would have been less, right? Because the tribes have always used fire um, to manage the land in California, and that's one thing I skipped over because I was kind of rushing. But when the early explorers came to California, they in their notes recognized and were curious about all of the smoke, and there was a lot of smoke in the air because tribal people used fire to manage the land. And it makes sense because they didn't have machetes and things like that to carve trails, but they used cultural fire or controlled burning to maintain open space and to manage pests and to allow for travel. So when this state was first settled, it looked very different because you wouldn't have overgrown forests where it's all tangly and thick and you can't get through, or you have a lot of dead wood. I just was driving from Calistoga over Berryessa, around by Berryessa and down into Davis, and it was really shocking how badly the land is managed and how much dead wood is out there. And there were some areas where there was some fuels reduction work happening. But in pre-colonization days, we would have been burning and taking care of all of that. So you would have a healthy forest and and the forests were actually it had happened for so long, there was an evolutionary process that occurred, and the trees need fire to reproduce. So many plants and trees need fire to reproduce the native species. And so fire returns native species, gets rid of the invasives because invasives don't like fire and they don't survive fire, which is what happens. And that's what happened in Southern California. You have a lot of invasive plants, and the invasive plants are dry, and they don't hold water, and they haven't evolved to survive and live and thrive with fire versus other native plant species. So um, things would be different and fires would be different if we brought fire into the environment. And so, yeah, these deed restrictions and the open space, I think initially, we're doing what we can to latch onto that and to step up as tribal responsible parties and manage the land because we want to. And then there's going to be those times where it's not about that. And tribes are acquiring land that they want to use freely. Um, and unfortunately they have to pay too much for the land. And I think that's a bigger problem that I'd like to maybe resolve through legislation to make it, there be a penalty when tribes are being required to pay well above appraisal value. Because that's the case right now, for lands. So if you have a tribe and they have a rancheria or a reservation and there's adjacent lands for sale, you can bet those landowners are not selling for appraisal value. They are selling at the highest possible value because they know that the tribes really want that land. So, that makes it a challenge because you can't use the grant funds to buy land for above appraisal value. So the grants can't be used for that because the landowners won't sell it for appraised value. So the only lands that can be purchased under these grants has to be for appraisal value. And most likely those are lands that are open space at this point in time, and maybe remote and not, necessarily suitable for construction or building. And so that's just kind of the universe we're in right now. But I think there's going to come a turning point where their land return could be for other things. But right now, tribes are reacquiring. So there's land return and then there's land reacquisition or land acquisition. And that's a big part of the work that we do here is both, land return, trying to navigate the system so that tribes can get land under their own stewardship again to protect their areas from catastrophic fire, so they can control the narrative and control what's on the ground. And then there's acquisition, which is where the tribe is going to have to come up with some money or find a strategic partner to do that. And so there are institutional investors and partners where you can do like tax credit deals and things like that. And those are available, but they are definitely different than a land return. So yeah, I don't see any questions. So I'm excited that I got to spend some time with everybody. I don't know if any of you had any questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I do, seeing no questions here, I will ask you if you don't mind a question. And you've already mentioned a few sort of legislative fixes or things that you think need to be done to address some of these ongoing barriers and challenges. I'm wondering, thinking that the task force is writing this report to the governor and the legislature, if there are things you haven't already said, but that you have on your mind as very important ways that the state can and should advance some of the land back projects that you've addressed today.
Mhm. Well, I did briefly kind of skip over it, but the Truth and Healing Council is going to be releasing their report this year. And so the Truth and Healing Council was created through an executive order that was issued by the Governor Newsom, to kind of accompany the apology. And that was to create this commission, and they were going to take a very deep, careful look and investigation into what happened in California in the early days. And again, like I said, it's not a pretty history. There's receipts. There's literally receipts for what happened here. You have so the Native American Heritage Commission has maps now that they've created where, you could tie the reward to the deed. For example, if somebody killed enough Indians, then they got land grant. And those are all traceable to the source of the funds. So the state had a fund, and they used that fund to pay people and militias and things like that for what they did. And so they're looking at all of that in great detail. They're creating a database or many databases, and then they are looking at what happened as a result of that. They're looking at the mission system. They're looking at the state's role in that, the state parks that are, museums or missions that are state parks, and what is their relationship to Native people. The fact that tribal people didn't have any benefits, even though the lands were taken and they were never included in any kind of programs until recently. What does the state do in a framework of restorative justice? And we're not talking about reparations in that kind of context, but we're looking at restorative justice because it's not a one-time thing. It's, well, what are the policy changes that are necessary to deal with this history and also just make things better and right in a different space. And there is a lot of unused land in the state of California. I mean, there's a lot of it. And all across the country, there's a lot. And it was all taken from, tribal people. So how does that all get addressed? And I don't know what the state recommendations are going to be from the Truth and Healing Council, but I'm assuming that they're going to be related to taxation and healthcare and economic development and infrastructure. Tribes' lands were taken by PG&E and other predecessors to other utilities, but they have very bad power. They have unreliable power. The grid kind of went around them. Utilities went around them, or cut through and didn't compensate them for the taking. So there's lots of, when you look at each tribe and their specifics, then it's like, well, what could the state do today to rectify this without it being necessarily some kind of controversial thing, that will result in some kind of blowback. But what are some common sense things to integrate tribal sovereignty into this framework? And I think they're going to try to figure that out right now. So I'm really curious what happens and what the words are in the report. But I'm hopeful. So yeah, I really appreciate anyone listening today, and hopefully I shared something that was new and you didn't think about before.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the time and the insight. Thank you all for attending today. I just wanted to quickly note for people attending that a week from today, next Tuesday, the 25th, at the same time, 2 to 3 p.m., we'll have our next speaker in this series. And hopefully from today's experience, you've all noted that these are some really engaging and informative presentations. So we encourage anyone to attend. Thank you again so much, Michelle, and thank you all for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.